everyone. Strap in because today we are going to take an epic journey with a real life Indiana Jones of the intellectual world, Conrad Elst. Picture this, a Belgian adventurer, not in jungles or lost cities, but weaving through the rich tapestry of Indian culture and history. Conrad Elst is not just any explorer. He is armed with a PhD in Asian studies and slicing through the complexities of Hindu nationalism and lighting up the corridors of history with his insights. So think of him as your favorite history teacher. So welcome, sir. So let's dive straight into our subject. You have been in India and we have witnessed the Pran Pratishtha of Ayodhya temple in January. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Because
But it was my pleasure. I mean, I was quite excited to be there.
Because I consider you more of an insider than an outsider. So you deserve this congratulations. So sir, how have you been drawn into this Ayodhya case? So let us go through this journey since you were involved in it, and what is the change that you have witnessed over a period of time?
Right. Well, I got involved simply because the affair was there. You know, I think it is also Edmund Hillary's reason for climbing the Mount Everest. He also said, you know, I had to do it because it was there. So I discovered this. I mean, I had never heard of the Ayodhya affair, and I ran into it through the Salman Rushdie affair. You see, when I came first in India in 1988, the book had just been banned, the book The Satanic Verses. And then there was a discussion between different factions of secularism. Not between Hindus and secularists or Hindus and Muslims, but between different factions of secularists. And so the hardliners, chiefly the communists, were against the ban, were in favor of criticizing religion, because as Karl Marx had said, the criticism of religion is the beginning of any criticism. And by contrast, the Congress sides were in favor of the ban, and you know, sophistically discovered all kinds of reasons, you know, justifications for the ban. Anyway, you see, what I concluded from this was that clearly in India secularism has a very different meaning from what it had at that time in Europe. Of course, in the meantime, let's say that Europe has followed India and is doing many of the wrong things that India did at the time, and that Europe at that time did not do. Now it does do that. Policies of appeasement, mainly. Anyway, so at that time, I thought it was useful to inform the international public about this bizarre aspect of the matter. And it's in that context that I discovered that actually it was an offshoot of the Ayodhya affair. You see, this one of the leaders of the Babri Masjid campaign against the temple was Syed Shahabuddin, lawyer, and he had threatened a Muslim march on Ayodhya to coincide with the Hindu festival taking place there. So in the atmosphere around Ayodhya, which was becoming more and more polarized, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi thought, well, this is going to be a bloodbath. Let's avoid this. So he invited Syed Shahabuddin, you know, we want you to call off this march. What do you want in return? It is a typical Congress horse trading. And so one thing he demanded was the ban on this book. And so Rajiv Gandhi said, yes, you know, freedom of speech, it's all very nice, but we have a bloodbath to prevent. That's more important. So, you know, that's when I discovered the Ayodhya affair.
Okay, so ban of satanic verses was used as a bargaining chip
Yes,
for temple and
yes.
okay. So apart from that, Shahabanu case was also there at.
Yes, and I think that that was part of Rajiv Gandhi's same game plan. You see, what he wanted to do was, first of all, let's be very clear about that, he wanted the temple built. Whether it was out of private conviction or simply because he saw that, you know, in the political power equation, this is where things were heading. At any rate, you know, he had made up his mind that the temple should be built. And so in return for that, he wanted to give some goodies to the Muslim leadership. So one of these was the Shabano, you know, overruling of the court verdict that made, you know, the usual secular law or human rights and so on prevail over the Sharia arrangement regarding alimony and divorce rights. So Rajiv Gandhi overruled that court verdict to make the Sharia again the leading principle for those cases. And so you see some people like Mohammed Arif Khan, who now is the governor of Kerala, if I'm well informed. You know, protested against it. I mean, Muslims protested against it. They wanted this more progressive secular law to prevail. But so Gandhi said, well, you know, in principle you may have a point, but you know, we have this arrangement. We have to do a few things favorable to Islam, to the Muslim leadership. So we need this Shabana law.
So one thing interesting that you told, was the politics as polarized as it is today? You were saying that it was not more of a Hindu-Muslim debate, it was a debate within the secularists.
No, you see, there was a certain polarization, but it was not all over the place. It did not fill the front pages. In the subsequent years it would. Okay. But at that time it was not yet the case. And so Rajiv Gandhi thought he could handle this, you see, with some compromises and so on. You know, it would not be a big affair. I mean, so many temples are being built, you know, it shouldn't be too difficult. And, you know, that changed especially because of the statement by the eminent historians in 1989 that there had not been a temple there. So until then it was accepted on all sides, including the local Muslims, that of course the mosque was built in forcible replacement of a demolished temple. And so that was not in doubt. Now suddenly that became a matter of doubt. Okay. And so then, you know, there was a big polarization because suddenly Ayodhya had become the Mecca of secularism. So, you know, the secularists, you know, wanted to defend the Babri Masjid with all they had in them. And so for mainstream politicians, like the congressmen mostly, this now became difficult. You see, they had accepted, okay, let's have this temple built. Suddenly, you know, this became the paragon of Hindu communalism and all that. And then they didn't feel so much like it anymore. So Rajiv Gandhi saw a way out of this through the evidence, because he knew that, of course, there is evidence for the existence of the temple. And so if historians started looking for it, they'd find even more of it. And that's what happened in January 1991, when he had by then become the leader of the opposition, but the government had fallen apart. There was a minority government dependent on his support. And so he made Prime Minister Chandrasekhar call a debate among scholars over the evidence. And a very interesting debate, and so that's where I got in, you know, practically, because a number of scholars like Well, ultimately, it started, of course, with a number of other people who presented pieces of evidence in the opinion page of the Indian Express, which was then edited by Arun Shourie, including Arun Shourie, who contributed a very important piece called Hideaway Communalism, about attempts to hide pieces of evidence. Anyway, and so a number of people contributed. Then and they did so, you know, as the only people there because the other side had not shown up. Okay. You see, in the first round, the people of the Babri Masjid Action Committee showed up, but these were Muslim clerics who didn't understand anything of history. You know, they more or less made fools of themselves. So Irfan Habib, Muslim-born but communist historians, decided to save them, and so he collected a few legitimate historians to represent the Babri Masjid Action Committee. But those historians didn't show up. They claimed that they needed more time to study the evidence or whatever. Anyway, so on the Hindu side, well, and not only, there were also some Muslims involved, but who defended the case for the temple. And so those pieces of evidence were then published by Voice of India. So they were entrusted to Sitaram Goel, who entrusted to me the task of stringing those pieces of evidence together in a coherent narrative. So that's my contribution.
So when you came, I don't know what shape secularism was back then in Europe. So there must be a lot of information that you must have confronted, which might be biased or contradictory. So how did you navigate through all that chaos and draw your own conclusions as an outsider? Yeah.
Well, the first thing to do is, of course, collect the data. And so, being here in India, of course, I was well placed to do so. I saw, the enormous distance between the narrative that had, taken hold of the public imagination abroad and the real facts. And so once I knew those, it was not so difficult. I mean, after all, not many possibilities existed. Either the temple was there or it wasn't. So, we found that it was there or that it had been there.
So, did Muslim victimhood did not impress upon you in any way? Could you consider
what Muslim victimhood?
As in, they had the rightful right over that place, and Hindus are displacing them.
Well, you see, they were sitting on stolen property, after all. Of course, yes, they had done the investment of building a mosque. That you have to give them, that's true. Well, they have been amply compensated for that now with a nice piece of land, but at a distance away from the Ram Janmabhoomi, where they are now building a 5-star mosque.
So what was your impression of Islamic iconoclasm back then?
Well, that's just a historical fact.
Okay.
And, you can, of course, research some details of it, what happened at this particular place. Is there a time gap between the demolition of the temple and the building of the mosque that stands there now? Because you have to see, there are different scenarios. One is that a temple is demolished and immediately a mosque is built in its stead. Like, for instance, in Ajmer, and you have the Adhai Din Ka Jhompra, which is a mosque that was built, as the name says, in 2 days and a half. Because when Muhammad Ghori came to conquer that area, he sent an advance party. And so to, impress their master, they immediately destroyed the temple and built a makeshift little mosque in its place, so that there would be a mosque awaiting him already when he arrived.
Okay.
And so there you clearly have the scenario of an immediate forcible replacement of a temple with a mosque. In other places it can be different. See, sometimes they're busy with waging war, so they quickly destroying a temple and then not returning to it immediately. Then later, when that place is lying empty in the middle of a city, then the sultan who has taken power there decides to build a mosque there. So there, and it's been discussed in the court verdict in 2010 by the Uttar Pradesh High Court that it is very certain that there was a temple there. What is less certain is the distance between the demolition of the temple and the building of the mosque. So one of the judges there, a Muslim by the way, or I don't know if that's important, but he said, yeah, you see, of course there was a temple there, but it's not proven that the mosque was built like to replace the temple. Maybe it was already, a ruined site for a while before someone took the decision to build a mosque there. Though he would still have known that there had been a temple there.
So how are these events reported in international media back then?
Well, they simply took over the narrative of the Indian secularist establishment, namely that this temple was a Hindu concoction and that there had never been a temple there and so on. That the poor, hapless Muslims were being deprived of a mosque.
So throughout your journey in writing about Ayodhya conflict, is there anything, what has been the most surprising and enlightening discovery for you personally?
Well, I don't know. You see, I visited Ayodhya at the time when the Babri Masjid was still standing. That was very unimpressive. You see, yeah, I mean, you read these reports, like now, you see with the Prana Pratishtha, there the international press has not denied that there was a temple there. I mean, you can't make that anymore. And it's so obvious that there was a temple. So they simply don't talk about it. They don't say, oh, this was, there's a temple rebuilt because there was an ancient temple there. They don't mention that. All they mention is, oh yeah, in 1992 a mosque was destroyed. And there it stops. And so, that's the situation now. And so to make it more dramatic, they say an ancient mosque has been destroyed. Now you see, if you say it's ancient, you think of marvels of culture like Ajanta and Ellora, or the Acropolis in Athens or something, the pyramids or what. Now if you saw that mosque, you see, it was like nothing is lost with that. With that building, it was poor. It was also, dilapidated. Architecturally there was nothing interesting about it. That's for sure. Of course, as a historian, I'm rather in favor of keeping pieces of history. But in this case, it's very obvious this was put there in order to deprive Hindus of their place of pilgrimage. So it's correct that this has been restored.
So, did this question personally bother you, that is Ram merely a mythology or a poet's imagination?
Yes. Okay, now let's be clear, that is a different question. Of course, that question interests me, but it's a different question. You see, it does not have anything to do with the question whether there should be a temple there.
Exactly.
Because secular law is not concerned with the contents of these beliefs. It simply notes that there are fellow human beings who hold this belief. To the extent that we make way for this belief, we have to do this regardless of whether the belief is true or not. Why is Mecca sacred? Supposedly it was built by Adam. Now, you see, no government, not in India, not anywhere else, is asking the Muslims, okay, you want to go there? Well, you can only go there if first you give proof that Adam and no one else built it, built the Kaaba. Now, and the nonsense, you see, there simply is that pilgrimage based on nobody knows why these religious beliefs are there, but okay, you see, we facilitate this pilgrimage. So similarly in Ayodhya, whatever the story of Rama, it is being believed, and so it's accepted as a religious accomplished fact. However, the question of whether Rama existed, yes, is important.
Mm.
So I think Congress some years ago went to the court and pleaded that Rama was only a mythological figure, and many people say it. Now that's not correct. You see, for anything that history is worth, Rama certainly was a historical character. His own adventures with his wife being abducted and so on, that's less certain, but we know it's a thing that regularly happens. Like, for instance, the wife of Genghis Khan was abducted and recovered. And so this could have happened to Rama, or it could have happened to other ancient Indian rulers. But you see, at any rate, the existence of Ram, that's firm. You see, you have the king lists. And so they start in the Adi Parva, and then you get them later in the Puranas. Then there are pieces of genealogies tucked away somewhere in the Brahmanas and other ancient writings. And so they form a coherent corpus. Here and there they differ, which helps prove that they're genuine. I mean, if all people in some event give the exact same testimony, then you know that this has been tutored. So in reality it won't be perfect, but it's quite good. And you see, in the case of India, many people poo-poo these king lists. They say, yeah, but the Indians are so full of imagination. Well, the fact is that in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, you also have king lists. And historians could never have reconstructed the history of Egypt or Mesopotamia without the help of those king lists. They are used as a source of history. So, you see, there is no reason at all why it should be different in India. There is one thing remarkable though. You see, Indians are, allow me to say it, as an ugly, vicious colonial Gora, and nevertheless I'm going to say it, Indians are bad historians. Okay? They, for instance, have no sense of time depth. You see, if you say to Indians that, something happened 5,000 years ago, then they say, yeah, but, and then they pick up some event from 1,000 years ago and they say, no, this overrules that. No, it doesn't. You see? So, and in contemporary discussions, even among people with a certain intellectual equipment, nevertheless, you hear that type of mistake all the time. However, and so this is also said by great admirers of Indian culture who say, yes, you see, Indian culture has contributed to every field of human endeavor except history. Okay. If you look at Chinese history, any event after 800 BC, you know to the day exact. And in India, by contrast, you have famous figures like Kalidasa or Shankaracharya or so, where they say, this century could also be this century or this century. It's not very good. However, the king lists. You see, in India, the king lists go back much farther than in Egypt or Mesopotamia. And so it's hard to calculate. I mean, you have the lifetime of a king, but how long was he in power? Was he 10 years or 60 years? It all happens. Now, the Greek ambassadors at the time, the centuries after Alexander, there were Greek ambassadors in India, and they wrote home, reports about the affairs in the state that they were placed in. And so they report that the extant genealogies go back to the equivalent of 6,776 years BC. Okay. So that's quite impressive. That's for Manu, who starts the solar dynasty, or his son starts the solar dynasty, and then his grandson through his daughter starts the lunar dynasty, and and everything else follows. So I wouldn't, bet on that exact year, but at any rate, very long. And so as part of these king lists, we have the solar dynasty based in Ayodhya. Although, what does based in Ayodhya mean? We know that Manu founded the city which he called Ayodhya. We know that Rama was born in a city called Ayodhya. They were not the same city. And indeed, we have this in the Ramayana itself. It is mentioned that that city was founded by Rama's grandfather.
Okay.
So he moved the capital city. He retained the name, but it was a different city. And effectively, if you do archaeological digging, you can't get beyond the second millennium BC, 1500, 1800, but not really much farther.
Okay.
And so more ancient kings like Manu, like Ikshvaku and so on, you haven't found where they were. So here you get a very interesting thing. You see, with the archaeological, mapping of Ayodhya, we can get back to Rama and up to his grandfather, Aja, but not beyond that. So you get a new question. You see, the earlier Ayodhya, the Ayodhya of Ikshvaku. Okay, so that must be a different city, probably somewhere in the Harappan culture, somewhere in Haryana or somewhere there. And so that the search is on. Okay. So any archaeologists who are watching this, let me ask you, please start looking. But so the history of the dynasty goes back much beyond Rama. But so at least we can go back to the age of Rama.
Okay.
So he was definitely a historical character. The idea that it's all invented, it's all just myth, that's very anachronistic. You see, in the late 19th century, this was a very common narrative among academic historians. And so they claimed that all kinds of traditional events and persons had never existed. For instance, at that time you had much of the question, did Jesus exist? Among Christian historians. And so similarly, did the War of Troy actually happen? All kinds of peoples who are mentioned in ancient books like the Old Testament, did they really exist? Because we have no evidence of them, and so on. But at that time, skepticism was very strong. Now, meanwhile, the city of Troy has been dug up. No Bible scholar today will say Jesus didn't exist. What they say now is that, he was not the Son of God. He was not born from a virgin, he was not resurrected from the dead, but he did exist. There was some exorcist healer wandering through Palestine, and so that extreme skepticism that's out. And so in India there are still secularists or so-called rationalists,
right.
Who lambast all these traditional stories, who say, this is all invented. Well, they think that they are very progressive and very modern by saying that actually they're obsolete.
Because it has no connection.
Well, you see, Rama and other such people did exist. Now, of course, what makes it more difficult for historians or more interesting is that you don't know what exactly is true in the Rama narrative. I mean, that there were airplanes, which Hanuman used and so on. Sorry, that's not true. So you see, once the narrative is there, once somebody says, this is an interesting story, this is an edifying story also, let's put it in verse and so on, then of course the process of poetic imagination starts to play its role also. Then in the case of the Ramayana, not so much, that's a very self-contained story. In the case of the Mahabharata, you have all kinds of deforming, distorting factors. You have a basic narrative about a war of succession between two branches of a royal family. But then all kinds of things happen. You see, the story is modified, made more interesting, or well-known ancient mythological motives are inserted in the story. Like, for example, there is a famous Indo-European motive about the hero being made invulnerable. You find Achilles, he's baptized by his mother in some magic potion, but she holds him by his heel, so he's still vulnerable in his heel, and that's where he gets killed. And Siegfried does the same thing. He takes a bath in the blood of the dragon he has just killed, but some oak leaf falls on his shoulder, and there later he gets shot, and so on. So you get this narrative also in the Mahabharata, in fact several times. Gandhari at one point, because she has this blindfold all her life, her eyes become very powerful. They have magic power. And so if she takes off her blindfold and she watches her son, merely the look will make him invulnerable. But then, the Duryodhana gets prevailed upon, but you see, appearing naked before your mother, that's bad manners. At least you should put on a loincloth. And he does, right. Which means that there he isn't invulnerable, and there he gets killed in the end. And Krishna also is made invulnerable by the sage Durvasa, and so he's smeared with something, but he's standing on his feet while he's being, massaged, and so there he's still vulnerable. And later that's where a hunter shoots him by mistake. So that's an ancient narrative, much older than the Mahabharata events. They are about a real war that happened in maybe 1700 BC. And so that Indo-European story goes back to the time of Indo-European unity, when Germanic, Greek, Sanskrit and so on, all descended from a common language that was spoken in a limited area. And so that's before they expand and fragment and so on. So it's a very ancient mythological motive that is then inserted in this historical story, right? Then, to make it even more complicated, not only non-historical elements are inserted in the historical core, also other histories that really happened, but that are in reality unrelated to the major event, are also inserted. Like, for instance, in the Mahabharata you get mention of the Greeks, the Romans, the South Indian dynasties, the Cholas, Cheras, Pandyas, who did not exist yet at the time of the Mahabharata war. They also get inserted. And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not obvious. Like, for instance, Krishna has a problem with his Jarasandha, and so he's the king of Magadha. Now we know later on Magadha becomes very powerful because it is the center of the iron mines. So once the Iron Age started, it becomes very profitable. They become rich, they become powerful, and they start the first empires, the Nanda Empire, Maurya Empire. Now, them attacking Krishna in 1500 plus BC, that's not indicated by history. You see, the great power of Magadha only starts later. So, is this some earlier king of Magadha who was quite adventurous and went all the way to Mathura to attack Krishna? Or is this simply a projection of an event from 1,000 years later onto the time of Krishna? Question. You see, and I mean, I'm quite optimistic that all this will one day be firmly known, but that, for instance, is an example of a thing that we don't know yet. So it's complicated, but it has a historical core, no doubt at all. So Rama did exist.
Okay. So how are political parties in India have leveraged this Ayodhya issue to shape national and regional identities?
Well, yeah, that has been going on already for many centuries. Many tribals, for example, have asserted their own legitimacy, their own place in Hindu society by highlighting some phase in the Ramayana where Rama or Hanuman or someone, did something important in their site, in their habitat. And this now has also been more artificially promoted by branches of the RSS, like the Vanavasi Kalyan Ashram. So that is there, as a factor of integration. To use it against that, you might highlight, of course, the role of some tribals or so. I don't see anything anti-integration within the Ramayana. There, you see the relation between Rama as a prince and these ordinary tribals, Hanuman and so on, is very fraternal, very good, very cordial. There's also no element of casteist, looking down on them or so. It's not there at all. In the Mahabharata, by contrast, there's all kinds of conflict material, and like for example, you have the case of the forests in what is now Delhi being burned, and all the living beings who try to escape from the fire are being killed by Krishna and Arjuna. And so I'm even surprised that the anti-Hindu party hasn't been making more of it, because actually, you could make it into a strong anti-Hindu case. You could say, well, it's long ago, but it's also a genocide. And at any rate, some tribal or Dalit or so movement might take this event and say, yeah, we are the natural enemies of the Krishna Valas, that they could say. Or you have the story of Ekalavya. Now, actually, that's a big mistake. You see, Ekalavya is not a tribal. He's actually also some prince. Moreover, he is not denied military training by Drona because of his caste, but simply Drona is being paid, so to speak, to train the princes, to make them invincible. And so obviously, if he teaches those skills to anyone else, that goes against his job. And so that's why he, denies Ekalavya the fruits of this training. It's not at all because of his caste. Nevertheless, that is very much used. Or from the Ramayana, you have the much later interpolation, which is the Shambhuka story, where Rama, after fraternizing with the tribals and so on, after living his life without any mention of caste, suddenly, he goes and for some irrational reason, kills a Shudra who is practicing austerities. So that's a later interpolation. That's when caste had become an institution. And so some people, and here you might use the word Brahmins, decide that they want to use the authority that by then Rama had gained in order to fortify, in order to help justify the institution of caste discrimination. So that's not authentic, but okay, it's there. You see, at some part in Indian history, later than Rama, but nevertheless, at some historical moment, caste discrimination was that serious. So you can of course discuss that, but if you take into account what Valmiki really meant, well, that was not part of it.
So Ambedkarites are well.
Yeah, I know. So many divisive tendencies today are being projected onto the ancient epics.
Hmm. So, you have come almost a full circle following this case from 1988 to the Pran Pratishtha. How have you seen the evolution of Indian society, and how much do you ascribe it to the politics, and how much to the technology and the ecosystem that is getting made?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, good question. The let's first of all be clear that the Rama temple today
Hmm.
is not the fruit of politics, at least not formally. So you see now the BJP is campaigning. Yeah, it is thanks to the BJP that you now have your Rama temple. Well, that's not quite true. The campaign for the Rama temple, for the liberation of Rama's birthplace, starts in 1983 at the initiative of two Congress politicians and one Hindu Mahasabha politician, namely Mahanta Vaidyanatha, who was the personal guru of Yogi Adityanath, the present chief minister. And among these others is Gulzari Lal Nanda, an ex-prime minister in Congress. So it's not that Congress was not involved. Very prominent congressmen are part of the Ayodhya movement.
Right.
Then the Vishwa Hindu Parishad the next year joins the bandwagon. And then it's only in 1989 that the BJP passes a resolution supporting this movement, and that they do only very briefly. It's a very popular issue, so it wins then the elections in 1989, 2 seats up to 85 seats. And then again in 1991 up to 120 seats and becoming the official opposition party, the leading opposition party. And then they dropped it like a hot potato. And so one of the reasons why the demolition happened was precisely the dissatisfaction of these Karsevaks with the lackadaisical attitude of the BJP that suddenly seems to have lost the appetite for moving towards building the temple. Another reason is that the Supreme Court had also disappointed and they had promised a verdict which had not come. But so it's not true that the BJP was behind the demolition or something. On the contrary, you see, they went to Ayodhya with the intention of showing the secularists, you are not able to control the Hindu masses, but we are. We guarantee the maintenance of the Babri Masjid.
You went for this?
Yes, of course. That's why L.K. Advani burst out in tears as he lost his composure completely when he saw the demolition starting. His spokesman at the time was Arun Shauri, who quickly drafted a statement, comparing this to the demolished temples in Kashmir that nobody made a fuss about and so on. And so sort of justifying what was happening, or at least explaining. And he, pushed it under Advani. No, come on, read this. You led this movement. You have to do something here. But so he was with it. He wasn't with his heart in it. Even the leader of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, Ashok Singhal, tried to stop the Karsevaks.
Okay.
And later on there was a Lieberhan commission that tried to determine the guilt for the demolition, and so they accused the BJP and so on. And so they questioned a number of leaders, and so even of the RSS, they said, there we had the somewhat unpleasant, job to stop the Karsevaks. There were actually confrontations, I won't say fights, but at least confrontations between the Karsevaks and us, as the organized Hindu movement. So now, of course, I know that in life things are complicated. So here it is not all that simple. So the BJP was definitely not in on it. But then again, you see, many BJP people had pro-Hindu feelings and actually enjoyed the sight of the mosque being taken down. like Murli Manohar Joshi. You know, he couldn't control the joy he felt when he saw all this happening. And then, but you see, that's what you know, your reaction afterwards. That doesn't mean you're, you know, guilty or responsible for it. However, there is someone in the Sangh definitely responsible. That is Moro Pant Pingle. He was one of the leaders of the RSS at the time. He's long dead now. Moro Pant Pingle.
Okay.
So that his name and his involvement that I have from a number of Karsevaks personally, as well as from the best informed Hindutva watcher in the world. And you might never have heard the name, but I mean Sridhar Damle. He's a Maratha or a Chitpawan, but born in Maharashtra, speaking Marathi, knowing these whole, you know, Hindutva circles personally. And so he wrote 2 or 3 books together with Walter Anderson from the State Department in Washington. And so you have this, I mean, if you want to know the data about the RSS, that's probably the best source. I mean, most books about it by all the usual Indologists are very biased. You know, this is good. However, you see the way that these books are written, you know, is kind of interesting. You know, Walter Anderson is a great scholar and a very powerful with all the connections with the good publishers and so on. But the legwork is done by his native informer, you know, by Sridhar Damle. Okay. And so he too confirmed to me that Moro Pant Pingle was very much involved. Now here I don't know exactly the power equation within the RSS. To what extent is it possible that one leader takes a political initiative at variance with the party lines set out by the other leaders? To what extent were the others or some others also involved and so on? You know, there you will need a thorough history, also studying the private correspondence in Marathi and so on. It's a big job. I see that it's a job to be done. I'm not going to do it. But I mean, clearly there was some Hindutva involvement also. For the Karsevaks there, it was purely spontaneous. You see, many of them didn't come there with some specific goal in mind. Once they saw the opportunity, they took it. There were also a few, you know, technically minded people who had prepared the technicalities of it, namely how to pull this building down. So where do you have to attach ropes to pull it down? That was also there. But so for most people it was purely spontaneous. And then they took it down and then they took the bricks home.
Took the bricks home?
Yes. So very soon the place was cleared because everything had been taken home.
So do you think with this Pran Pratishtha, has it busted the platitudes of secularism?
Yes, okay. Yeah, you had your question going back that far. I got a bit bogged down by the events in 1992. You see, after that, for the BJP, it became, I mean, they didn't really want the issue. It had become too much of a hot potato. And then it became like, you know, they couldn't publicly defend the Ayodhya cause anymore. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had allowed the demolition. Let's be clear, this is another point where Congress was involved in the move towards the temple. You see, he realized at that time it had become very difficult to demolish the mosque. Yet that was necessary if ever the temple was to be built. So he was quite glad that the Karsevaks did it for him. On the other hand, as a Congress politician, he was also happy that this way he could put the BJP on the defensive, because they would get the blame anyway. then he tried to get the Supreme Court to approve it, namely by passing judgment on the evidence. Like Rajiv Gandhi before him, he thought that the decision whether to build a new temple should depend on the evidence for the old temple.
Okay.
Which was a way of saying, I want a temple, because everybody knew what the evidence said. But the Supreme Court didn't want any of it. And so then, through difficult judicial paths, it ended up with the High Court of Uttar Pradesh. But then they really made work of it. So they studied the evidence. They organized material evidence. They organized the Archaeological Survey of India's excavations in 2003, which of course found the remains of the temple. And then they judged on the strength of the evidence that the place belonged to the Hindus.
Okay.
That's a decisive thing. So there are some, minor practical arrangements where that verdict in 2010 differs a bit from the final Supreme Court verdict in 2019. But the essence of it is that, yes, the place belongs to the Hindus.
Because there was a temple.
Yes. So that's the verdict in 2010. Now that's not at all the work of the BJP. This is when neither in Uttar Pradesh nor at the center the BJP was in power.
Right.
Indeed it was. You see, you can say that the judges, even without being pressured by politicians, nevertheless are sensitive to, the whole political atmosphere around them. Well, this was shortly after the 2009 elections, when the BJP was defeated, even worse than in 2004.
Right.
And I remember the time, you see, that the secularists, including foreign ideologists like Christos Jaffrelot, they were dancing on the corpse of Hindutva. They were very confident that the time of Hindutva, of Hindu nationalism, was over.
Okay.
And even then, the court ruled in favor of the Hindus. Why? Because the evidence was so obvious.
Okay. Interesting.
Right. But so that's what happened. The facts of history have spoken. It was not the doing of any political party. Now the atmosphere today, of course, is a very hurrah atmosphere, very feel good. The speech by Modi in Ayodhya at the time was also in that light. So I was there. I couldn't help becoming enthusiastic. You see, the whole atmosphere. I compare it to, for the Western audience, something they can understand is a rock concert. You see, there is also a lot of enthusiasm, and it's artificial. You see, nothing has happened to be enthusiastic about. A few people who start jumping and singing on a stage. That's not all that special. Whereas you had the same atmosphere here, but real. This was really about something, about a historical event. The return of the king.
Return of Rama.
And so I enjoyed the atmosphere there. And in fact, it was, I heard the speech, and later I also reread the speech to make sure, that I wasn't wrong about its contents. It was a rather good speech, in the sense that, at least for a prime minister, if a historian had given that speech, now that I wouldn't have liked. You see, a historian should have said, for example, that this was a Hindu temple destroyed by a Muslim invader. And so, that as a prime minister, is less important. He has to look into the future and, give guidelines for the future. where these religious conflicts are not to be promoted. They're a historical fact, yes, of course. They're still to a little extent with us, yet, our aim is to get rid of them. No more religious conflict. And so he never talked about Hindu, he never talked about Muslim. He said that, Rama has the capacity to unite India. I don't know if Asaduddin Owaisi feels very enthusiastic about his Rama. I'm not sure it unites Indians, it unites Hindus, yes. But so this is the new RSS line, they totally avoid the word Hindu. Some of these, communalism watchers, still keep writing, oh, it's a Hindu party and Hindu fanatics and so on. The reality is that they don't even use the word Hindu anymore. And, but, more interesting is that he also didn't use the word Muslim or Islam. And I think it shows a certain wisdom that he didn't. I mean, if I describe the history of what happened at the site, I can't avoid the word Islam. It's because of Islam that this iconoclasm took place. But nevertheless, if you look at the future, well then, what's wrong? You see, why should any problem, including Islam, be mentioned? You see, you have your temple now, and what more do you want? And so, in the past there was some unpleasantness between Hindus and Muslims, but that's the past. Here you can really say, let bygones be bygones. You see, as long as nobody interferes with this temple, as long as there is no temple destruction anymore, well, there is no problem, and there's no reason to mention it. So that is actually correct.
So he did wisdom in not
mentioning. I think that was correct, yes.
Okay. So one final question. How do you compare Ayodhya dispute and its resolution with other global instances where politics, religion and history have converged?
Yeah, well, you have the case of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul or in Constantinople, which was first a church, then was turned into a mosque, then Ataturk turned it into a museum, and then Erdogan turned it into a mosque again. So I mean, these sensitive places continue, and even that alone already makes a mockery of anyone who dramatizes the events in Ayodhya. At the moment, still there is a move by Muslims to Islamize these sacred sites. Nevertheless, it is much less than what used to exist in the Middle Ages, or until recently. When partition was imposed on Hindus, many Hindu temples were also destroyed and so on. It's not that distant, but nevertheless, there is a big change in atmosphere. For instance, you see many, pro-Muslim scholars and Muslim leaders themselves are now arguing, no, there was no temple destruction, or temple destruction was not all that serious, or they try to invent ways in which Hindus themselves were responsible for Muslims destroying Hindu temples. That's a new line of defense. Yes. Now, even though all this is untrue, nevertheless, the fact that they attempt means that they realize that temple destruction is not a good thing. That you need a special justification because normally this is not done. This is some kind of a crime. So you see that the consciousness in the Muslim community is evolving. It's not very Islamic to say that there's something wrong with temple. It's, for instance, not Islamic at all to allow a Hindu temple to come up in the Gulf states, as has just now happened. I mean, Muhammad himself has forbidden this. You see, no idol temples, at least on the Arabian Peninsula. So there is something moving, you know, that you can't deny that. So there is Islam as a theoretical system, which is unchangeable. Then you have the effective behavior of Muslims, which undeniably is evolving.
So do you think the Ayodhya will remain the only site which has been reclaimed peacefully?
Well, I'd make a distinction between these three sites that they had claimed and then all the rest. They say 40,000 or so. I won't vouch for any specific number, but many. Now, I am not at all in favor of, busying yourself with reclaiming all these temples. What you should reclaim is the souls of the Muslims, and when they come back, they will bring back their places of worship. As for these three, well, I see both Mathura and Kashi evolving in the right direction. Even though you see the Places of Worship Act, strictly speaking, disallows any change in status of religious sites except for the Ram Janmabhoomi. But de facto, trials are already happening concerning both Kashi and Mathura. And certain decisions go in the pro-Hindu sense. So that I guess that can be worked out without any violence. About the other sides, well, I suppose that Muslims would feel very threatened if the other sides also get reclaimed. So it is, strictly speaking, justified to reclaim these sites. Nevertheless, you have to take into account other factors, and so you shouldn't be too loose, with too frivolous with the risk of violence. Certainly not if there are alternatives. And so what I see at the moment is that not only there is a mentality change among believing Muslims, there is also something else happening. Namely, many Muslims are leaving Islam. And this is more and more the case as, first of all, the historical research into the sources of Islam, the philosophical research into the sort of nature of Islamic belief and so on, that's all evolving quite fast. And what makes a difference, this is not in some dusty library among a few scholars. No, you see, this is now in public, and now, with podcasts and so on, this is now, on every TV screen.
Right.
And so, also, in the 90s, you had people like Sitaram Goel who were carrying the message. Today, this is taken over by ex-Muslims. And so, I could understand if some Arab or Turk or so is not going to believe me, but you see, they are far more susceptible to being persuaded by fellow Arabs, Turks, Pakistanis, whatever, who have left Islam and who are holding open the door for them to also leave. And so, since that is happening, I think it is a mistaken priority to be so fussy about these temples. I'm quite confident that the issue of these temples is going to be worked out in the near future.
Okay, so with this hopeful note, so that's a wrap on today's discussion with Elst. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.